Hey, everybody. It is Monday, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Nunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. On this St. Patrick's Day, Jill, a younger version of me, would have been out there celebrating, despite not being Irish.
Everyone's Irish on St. Patrick's Day, right?
That is true. We celebrate the patron saint of Ireland, St. Patrick, but everyone partakes in Chicago. Famously, they dye the river green every year. So there's a whole bunch of traditions here in the U.S. and around the world.
Yes, you asked me what I was doing for St. Patrick's Day, and I said, preferably going to bed early. If that happens, I don't know, but that's the goal.
It's a normal Monday for many of us. Once you have families and you leave your 20s, it's just another day. Speaking of family, we were out at the Natural History Museum in New York City over the weekend. Friends of ours from D.C., Toby and Michelle and their girls were up here. It was very cool, Jill, because we ran into a few Mo News fans in the wild coming through various exhibits. People were like, I ran into one community member who was in from Utah and was like, oh my God, I was wondering whether I would see you in New York. I'm like, well, New York's a pretty big place, but today is your lucky day. So always appreciate meeting all of you out there. Always say hi if you see us out and about.
Absolutely. I've actually had people, I think, just recognize me from my voice, where I've been almost from behind, where they're like, are you Jill? And I said, yeah. They're like, we recognized your voice. We listened to the podcast. And it's always awesome.
Yes, always great to see all of you out there. By the way, Natural History Museum, a lot of fun exhibits. We saw the butterfly exhibit yesterday where they have it's thousands of live butterflies in there. You walk through there. And then there's this room, this middle room where you have to scan to see whether there's any kind of stowaway butterflies that have climbed on you and are trying to escape the facility. So they have to scan your body to make sure there's no butterflies kind of hiding, hoping to.
No hitchhikers?
No hitchhikers. No hitchhiking butterflies. Feel like there's a Disney movie in there somewhere with the butterflies trying to make their escape from the museum.
All right, let's get to some headlines here, starting with tons of news on the immigration front. President Trump invokes the Alien Enemies Act for the first time since World War II.
Yeah, this is a law from 1798. Think President John Adams. A judge has pushed back on it. And nonetheless, several hundred migrants deported over the weekend. We'll tell you where and what it all means.
The president also drafting a list for new travel bans targeting 43 countries. And the crackdown on student visas continues, including more pro-Palestinian Columbia University protesters. Also on the political front, President Trump issues an executive order slashing Voice of America.
And a bunch of global U.S. media that have been in existence for decades.
To the weather, tornadoes, wildfires, and blinding dust sweep across the United States, leaving at least 36 people dead. Overseas, the U.S. targets Houthi rebels in Yemen. March Madness is here. The NCAA brackets are set. We'll tell you about the top seeds. And Ted Lasso, renewed for season 4. And Jason Sudeikis is returning.
Yeah, this was the biggest, happiest news for many of you this weekend.
Especially because after the last season, I thought they were calling it quits.
Most people did.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
We'll talk about our friend, St. Patrick, as well as a couple notable pop culture items on this day in history.
Okay, a lot of developments on the immigration front over the weekend. President Trump on Saturday invoked the Alien Enemies Act for the first time since World War II. The law was first passed by President John Adams back in 1798. It grants the president sweeping powers. President Trump believes it will let him deport people associated with a Venezuelan gang on a rapid basis without due process. The act is a sweeping wartime authority that allows non-citizens to be deported without being given the opportunity to go before an immigration or federal court judge. After a lawsuit by the ACLU and other groups, a judge ordered the White House several hours later on Saturday evening not to deport anyone and turn around any deportees that were already being sent out of the country. However, it appears the Trump administration still sent hundreds of Venezuelans accused of being gang members of Tren de Aragua to a prison in El Salvador. El Salvador's offered the U.S. prison space in exchange for money. So the U.S. is paying the country about $6 million to take in 30 prisoners. That's about $20,000 per prisoner. Video posted by El Salvador's president on Sunday contained movie-like scenes set over a music soundtrack. They depicted soldiers leading the deportees, forcing them to bend toward the ground as they were frog marched to waiting buses. They had their heads shaved by hooded prison guards. Statements from El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, and from Trump allies mocked the judge's court order. Bukele tweeting, "Oopsie, too late," along with a tears of joy emoji just above a New York Post headline about the judge ordering the plane bound for El Salvador to return to the United States. The question is, where were the prisoners as of 7 p.m. when that order came through? The video from El Salvador appears to be late at night. Justice Department lawyers submitted a 2-page filing to the judge on Sunday afternoon that appeared to assert that the planes carrying the deportees were outside of the judge's jurisdiction by the time that he had ordered them to turn back.
So a lot here in terms of questions as to whether they abided or didn't abide by the judge's order, as well as a 1798 law that is meant for wartime deportations. Now, the White House view of this, Trump's view of this, is that America has faced an invasion of people arriving here illegally for several years. What he has referred to is a war of sorts. A judge, of course, will have to determine whether what we face now on the immigration front is technically viewed as a war based on the interpretation of that 1798 law. Nonetheless, Trump is saying that Tren de Aragua here, which has gang members in a number of American cities, is, quote, perpetrating, attempting, and threatening an invasion of predatory incursion against the territory of the U.S. He says the gang is engaged in irregular warfare at the direction of the Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. has declared Tren de Aragua, TDA for short, and several other Latin American gangs and cartels foreign terror organizations, so on par with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, with Hamas, with other groups. So that's the larger argument when it comes to the law. Then you have what took place on Saturday. You have the judge ruling Saturday evening, listen, everything has to pause right now because we have to determine that the people that you're about to deport or deporting, are they all here illegally? What crimes have they committed? We have to make sure that we have our ducks in a row here before we deport people. Reportedly, while this hearing was taking place, the judge gave the Justice Department time to look into whether any planes had departed. It is during that time, during that break in the proceedings, is they believe that this plane took off for El Salvador, or planes took off for El Salvador, leaving Texas. And so then they come back, and there are questions as to when this order came through from the judge. He filed it at 6:45. It hit the website at 7:30, though the government was aware of when the order came through. Where was this plane? Was this plane in the air and able to turn around? Like you mentioned, they're saying that it was out of his jurisdiction, meaning it was over the border at that time, at least what the White House is arguing here. So these guys landed. They were taken into arrest. El Salvador has made a whole to-do about how their prison population, how they arrest folks. You might have seen photos. You give a Google to El Salvador prisons. Bukele has made a point of his crackdown on crime in the country. And you have the White House, the Justice Department here, basically sort of giving the finger to the judge here. You have a statement from the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who's criticized the judge, saying that the judge supported terrorists over the safety of Americans. She added that the Justice Department, this is the Attorney General again, would be undeterred in its work, that the White House and the Department of Homeland Security will stop this invasion. The White House had a similar statement saying this operation saved countless American lives. We should note that these members of TDA were in immigration detention in the U.S. already for some period prior to being deported. Now, remember when Rubio took over as Secretary of State, one of his first trips there, his first trip literally was to Central America, including a visit to El Salvador. And that's where Bukele, this increasingly authoritarian leader who was initially democratically elected, but has sort of taken on the systems there, has said, listen, hey, America, you want to send your non-citizens here? Bring them. You want to send your citizens here? Bring them. I will house them in my prisons. You will pay me money, several $1,000s per prisoner. I have this 40,000 person prison. I have space for Americans and non-Americans, whoever you want to send me, as part of the deal there. So there was a lot of back and forth there. Thank yous between Elon Musk and Bukele, Trump and Bukele. And so you had this video put out over the weekend saying, this is what I'm going to bring you. It meant as a deterrence thing. So a lot of legal proceedings here related to, again, that law from 1798, as well as specifically what took place on Saturday, the several hundred who were deported. Many people asking me, Jill, what do we know about these individuals? It's like, I don't know much besides the White House has said these guys were criminals. They haven't given us a list of names. And the judge in this case was concerned, saying, I would like some sort of oversight of this to make sure that wires weren't crossed. We didn't mistakenly send the wrong person to El Salvador to have their head shaved and put into a 40,000 person prison.
And all of this comes as the Trump administration is also considering issuing travel restrictions for the citizens of dozens of countries as part of a new ban. Now, this is according to sources familiar with the matter and also an internal memo seen by several media outlets this weekend. The memo lists a total of 41 countries divided into 3 separate groups. The first group of 10 countries includes Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, and North Korea, among others. So those would be set for a full visa suspension. And then in the second group of 10 countries, including Russia, Pakistan, Haiti, Myanmar, and South Sudan, they would face partial suspensions that would affect tourist and student visas, as well as other immigrant visas, with some exceptions. And then there is a third group, a total of nearly 24 countries, including Cambodia, Liberia, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, and Zimbabwe, among others, that would be considered for a partial suspension of U.S. visa issuance if their governments, quote, do not make efforts to address deficiencies within 60 days. The list has yet to be approved by the administration, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and it could be amended.
Yeah, this is very preliminary. And if you recall, go back 8 years. Remember, one of the first big controversies of that first Trump administration was his Muslim travel ban that impacted a bunch of people in Muslim-majority countries. This time, he's expanded it out. This is 40-something countries with multiple tiers here. It's not clear whether people who already have existing visas from these countries would be exempted from the ban or if their visas would be canceled, nor is it clear whether this will include green card holders from these countries who came through on a visa, now have a green card, given what we've seen unfold with the Columbia University student, which we'll get to in a second here. Now, the reason for some of these is pretty clear, right? Like blocking travel for people from places like Iran, North Korea, Yemen, given the state of war, adversaries, makes sense. Others not as clear. Bhutan, for example, is on the list for an absolute ban of entry. Bhutan is this very small country. It's a Buddhist and Hindu country in between China and India. Not clear why they were on some of these draft lists for a complete ban of their citizens coming here. Then you have that second tier, the partial restrictions. That includes visitors from Russia. Interesting to see how that unfolds given the negotiations with Russia and Ukraine there. And also notable on that list is Pakistan, which typically has a pretty good relationship with the U.S. government, cooperation on national security matters, on intel matters. And so we're going to see how this all unfolds, which countries end up on the finalized list. But that list of 40-something countries you saw over the weekend looks like it's still in draft form.
Staying with immigration and the crackdown on student visas, specifically at Columbia University and some other campuses, continues. A second Columbia University student involved in pro-Palestinian protests on campus was arrested over visa violations. Laka Cordia, a Palestinian from the West Bank, was arrested for overstaying her student visa. So that visa was actually terminated back in 2022 because of a lack of attendance, but she still remained in the United States. She had been previously arrested during protests on campus last April, but her arrest on Friday follows last week's detention of Mahmoud Khalil, who was a green card holder who was also involved in the Columbia protests.
Right. They're really pushing back here at Columbia University specifically. That is where the administration has also given the administration there a list of a number of things they need to do if they want to see the $400 million or so in research funding and other grants the federal government has frozen for the university, the government playing hardball with Columbia and a number of other campuses. Now, the Khalil case, as we've told you about, very controversial, given that he's a green card holder, married to an American here. The Cordia case, she's violated her visa. She apparently stayed again in the U.S. for several years after the visa was revoked and still engaged in protests and got arrested. And so it appears here to be a more straightforward case. And then there's another case that we're following, the Trump administration revoking the visa of another student, this student named Ranjani Srinivasan. She's an Indian student, a PhD student, whose visa was revoked on March 5th. The administration arguing that she advocated for violence and terrorism. They didn't provide additional details, though, about what specifically her conduct was that led them to come to this assertion. Srinivasan is an Indian citizen. She was pursuing a doctoral degree in urban planning. And this story is very interesting. The New York Times actually caught up with Srinivasan, who left the country before she could be arrested. She says that 3 federal immigration agents showed up at her door last week. She didn't open the door, and she knew that her visa had recently been revoked. The next day, she decided to book a flight to Canada before they could come again. So when the agents arrived the next night with a warrant, and that happened to be the same night that they also arrested Mahmoud Khalil, she'd already left. She had packed her luggage, given her cat to a friend, and left on a flight to Canada. So she's speaking to the media here, saying that she didn't open the door for immigration. The next day, she decided to leave. She still hasn't gotten clarity as to why her visa was revoked in the last couple of weeks. What she does believe is that the situation traces back to last year. She actually was arrested on Columbia's campus the same day that anti-Israel protesters actually occupied one of the university buildings. You might have remembered this, Hamilton Hall. They renamed it. She was not a part of the break-in. She was not a part of the protest. Apparently, she says she was having a picnic with friends that night and was making her way back home as she was trying to make her way through protesters and barricades. And that's when she says police pushed her, arrested her. She asserted she was not part of the protest. Her case was dismissed in court. But now you have the administration going through the list of, I guess, all arrests. And they've asserted here again. They haven't given further details on Srinivasan, but they're in the midst of revoking visas for people who were arrested last year, regardless of circumstances. So we'll wait to hear more details there. But interesting case on Srinivasan. This is the person who Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, said on Friday, self-deported. She takes issue with that, saying, again, I wasn't involved in that. I was caught up in this. But in the meantime, she's watching things unfold from Canada.
Meanwhile, staying with developments in Washington, the Trump administration over the weekend began gutting U.S.-backed global media, including the decades-old Voice of America that broadcasts news to millions of people around the world. The move comes after President Trump signed an executive order to hollow out a string of small government agencies and offices late Friday. The order calls for the U.S. Agency of Global Media, which oversees Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and a collection of other media outlets globally, to be, quote, eliminated to the maximum extent consistent with applicable law. So virtually the entire staff of Voice of America, we're talking more than 1,300 journalists, producers, and support staff, has been placed on administrative leave over the weekend. Many of the news channels abruptly changed to broadcasting music. The Trump administration argued that they were no longer useful and that their news coverage had gotten too liberal or woke. And so he decided to gut the networks. They pointed to recent headlines that showed the network wouldn't call Hamas terrorists and posted a story about white privilege. Trump ally and former Arizona Senate and gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake, a major critic of most media, including VOA, was recently brought on as an advisor to deal with the outlets.
Yeah, so Kari Lake was like, I'm going to take apart all of this, similar to what you've seen with the Department of Education and Linda McMahon. The Kari Lake literally was brought in to lead a group that she's supposed to take apart. So you have this U.S. Agency of Global Media that oversees Voice of America. It's an independent agency established by Congress years ago. Their goal has been, for decades, going back to the Cold War, to combat propaganda from then the Soviet Union, now from places like China, Russia, in Iran. Many people sent me notes that they remember growing up in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, tuning to Radio Free Europe, Voice of America to actually understand what was happening in the world because they were only getting propaganda from their own governments. Nonetheless, you have the Trump administration arguing here that they now push out liberal propaganda. Elon Musk said over the weekend, nobody listens to them anymore. It's just radical left crazy people talking to themselves while torching $1 billion in U.S. taxpayer money. The Voice of America alone, we know, had a budget of several hundred million. When you add in these others and some of these other agencies, you get to about $1 billion. Some history here. Voice of America, created in 1942, broadcasting globally. Its charter was signed into law by a Republican president, Gerald Ford, back in the 70s, saying that this is about the long-term interests of the U.S. to communicate directly with people around the world, offer them accurate, objective, comprehensive journalism. There's laws that have been passed in the 90s and the 2010s that should have protected Voice of America from interference by the U.S. government. And it's gotten pretty bipartisan praise. Michael McCaul, he's a Republican. He used to run the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He said in a statement recently that networks like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, etc., are disseminating important information, in particular in China, where the ruling Communist Chinese Party has sought to actually block these. And that's notable to folks as we take apart these networks, is that these were the bane of the existence of people like Vladimir Putin, like the Chinese government, like the Iranian regime, and was part of U.S. foreign policy, right? Getting information out there. Now, in the internet age, in the VPN age, there are other ways for people to get information. Nonetheless, you saw actually the Shanghai Daily, which is a Chinese Communist Party newspaper in China. Some of their members celebrated the news that Radio Free Europe, Liberty, the various networks were being taken apart. Excellent news in all caps. Someone tweeted over there saying that it was an anti-China propaganda outlet. Steve Kappas, who is a former colleague of mine, he actually used to be the president of NBC News, ran the CBS Evening News for a bit. He is currently the president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He put out a statement saying the cancellation here is a massive gift to America's enemies, the Iranian Ayatollahs, Chinese communist leaders, autocrats in Moscow and Minsk. We'll celebrate the demise here. Handing our adversaries a win will make them stronger and America weaker. So that's the argument from the journalist community, the people who work there. Again, you got the Trump administration saying this didn't serve its purpose anymore. It had gotten too liberal. Some people argue maybe you could have reformed it in some way as opposed to taking the whole thing apart. But it comes as, you have these massive cuts that Doge is intending, that the Trump administration is pushing. And so they saw this as an easy way to cut nearly $1 billion out of the annual $7 trillion government budget. But like everything else we've been telling you about, Jill, expect lawsuits on this one.
All right, time for the speed read. Let's start with some dangerous weather across the country. From the Associated Press, violent tornadoes and high winds decimated homes, wiped out schools, and toppled semi-tractor trailers as a monster storm killed at least 36 people across the central and southern United States. The dynamic storm also produced dust storms and icy conditions. It earns an unusual high-risk designation from weather forecasters and was blamed for deadly dust storms in the nation's midsection, icy winter weather in the northern part of the country, and severe thunderstorms on Sunday, including on the West Coast. Authorities are still sifting through massive tornado damage. Missouri, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Alabama all have confirmed fatalities.
Yeah, a tragedy over the weekend across a good part of the Midwest and the South. A number were killed in a tornado outbreak across the Midwest and the Southeast on Friday and Saturday. The dust storm you mentioned, Jill, 8 people killed, 70 vehicles involved in a massive highway pileup in Kansas. And so that was the impact there. There was also a dust storm in the Texas Panhandle and Amarillo, where at least 3 people were killed in car crashes. The extreme weather conditions impacted an area of about 100 million people. And, you had the dust storms and you had a blizzard in the northern areas. You had wildfire risk in drier places. So just a number of weather events. You also had an earthquake very briefly in Mississippi, a very rare earthquake. And so they were watching that there. You had Oklahoma communities, more than 100 fires across the state right now, 300 homes damaged there. So there's a lot happening in the region right now. So definitely stay close to your weather forecasts.
From the Washington Post, U.S. forces launched an attack on Houthi terrorists in Yemen over the weekend. President Trump says he called for a decisive and powerful attack. The group has been targeting maritime traffic and American troops in the Red Sea. Trump's order also doubled as a sharp warning to Iran, its major backer. So U.S. warships and jets launched attacks across Yemen, targeting radars, air defense sites, and drone launch points. The operation marks the beginning of a renewed campaign to degrade Houthi military capabilities. Trump writing on social media, the Houthi attack on American vessels will not be tolerated. We will use overwhelming lethal force until we have achieved our objective. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the operation was a powerful and clear message to the Houthis and that attacks on U.S. vessels and global shipping must stop. In his statement, the president directly addressed the militants' sponsors in Iran who are believed to provide them with weapons and funding. He wrote, support for the Houthi terrorists must end immediately in all caps there, warning the government in Tehran that America will hold you fully accountable and we won't be nice about it.
Yeah, so a reminder, the Houthis among the various armed groups around the region that are armed by Iran, that are trained by Iran. And it comes as you've gotten multiple messages here from the White House to the Iranians in recent days. You're seeing carrot and stick in sort of the old diplomatic parlance. You give them carrots, but you also use sticks as a way to get countries to do what you need. And so that's the stick, right? The punishment there. The carrot in recent days was a letter from Trump to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, in hopes of securing a new agreement to limit Tehran's nuclear program. The Iranians haven't engaged here yet, but you see, basically both things happening at the same time. The U.S. saying, hey, we'll make a deal, but we're also going to bomb the Houthis, and we're going to end that. The Houthis, by the way, going back to October of 2023, so we're a year and a half now of them effectively cutting off most shipping traffic through the Suez Canal, Red Sea, costing billions of dollars to companies and then consumers around the world. They did this out of solidarity for Hamas and the Palestinians. They've continued. The Biden administration, along with the UK and several other countries, have launched various attacks on the Houthis over the course of the past few months to get them to stop. They haven't. Trump has said that his predecessor, Biden's approach was, quote, pathetically weak, and he will get the Houthis to stop here. Jill, we should note this war in Yemen, the Houthis go back more than a decade. The Saudis unleashed all kinds of force and war, leading to massive death and destruction for a number of years using U.S. weaponry. The Houthis yet continue to grab more land and grab more power there in Yemen. So we'll see what comes of the new Trump administration attempt to crack down on the Houthis. It really, I think, to the point you just made, needs to come from Iran, where Iran needs to tell the Houthis, cut it out, and they haven't done that yet.
From CNN, a crew of astronauts who will take over duties on the International Space Station from NASA's Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore have arrived at the orbiting laboratory.
Woohoo!
They're almost home, Moshe.
They're almost home. Jill, I actually happened to be awake like Saturday night, and that was when, right around midnight Eastern time, the SpaceX capsule was docking with the space station, because, that's what I do with my weekends.
So this lets the duo return home after a days-long journey turned into a 9-month politically charged trip. The Crew 10 mission is part of a routine staff rotation jointly operated by NASA and SpaceX. It launched Friday night, and then it docked at the space station late Saturday, early Sunday morning, Moshe, as you were watching on television.
On my phone, Jill. On YouTube.
Okay. So modern. So the astronauts will spend a few days in a handover period with Williams, Wilmore, and their fellow Crew 9 astronauts. The Crew 9 Dragon capsule has been docked at the space station since September. If all goes according to plan, Williams, Wilmore, and 2 others will climb aboard the Crew 9 spacecraft and head back to Earth as soon as Wednesday. Williams and Wilmore began their trip to the ISS in June, if you remember, when they piloted the inaugural crewed test flight of Boeing's Starliner capsule. But multiple problems with the vehicle cropped up en route to the station, including propulsion issues and helium leaks. And those challenges prompted NASA to extend Williams and Wilmore's stay on the space station as mission teams assessed the issues. Ultimately, NASA decided last summer that it would be too risky to return Williams and Wilmore home aboard that Boeing vehicle.
You remember the old expression from Boeing, if it's not Boeing, it's not going?
Yes, I was once on a flight and the flight attendant said, if it's not Boeing, we're not going.
Well,
take that, reverse it.
Yeah, take it and reverse it for space. Right now, Boeing is still working. I feel for you. I know some of you in the Mo News community actually worked on the Starliner. We're very excited about that launch in June. And then there was issue after issue. They had to return the Boeing capsule without humans for safety purposes. Now, it did make it back to Earth okay. They're still figuring it out. Enter SpaceX, the other private competitor, and Elon Musk, who runs SpaceX, saying, okay, we'll get them home. There's been a lot of politically charged back and forth about this, questions as to could they have gotten home earlier or not, unclear, because depending on who you believe, you're hearing different stories. Nonetheless, Jill, one word they're pushing back on, the 2 astronauts, is the word stuck. We're referring to the fact that they've been stuck in space for 9 months. NASA doesn't like that word. The astronauts don't like that word because technically, in case of emergency, they could have gotten home. But let's be honest, they were stuck. Okay. But they want to reframe things. Wilmore did an interview with CNN in recent days where he said, yes, I may have spent 9 months in a place that I was supposed to be at for eight days, but this whole narrative from day one, this is Wilmore talking, stranded, abandoned, stuck. I get it. We both get it. But help us change the narrative. Prepared and committed, despite what you've been hearing, that's what we prefer. In September, Williams called the space station happy place. I love being up here in space. It's just fun. Every day you do something that's work, quote unquote. You can do it upside down. You can do it sideways. So it adds a little different perspective. They've also insisted they had plenty of food, are well fed this entire time. So this whole idea that like they were stranded, etc., sort of kind of true, but they don't like that spin on it because, Jill, this has been their dream to go to space. They thought they were getting there for 8 days. They got to spend 9 months in space. So they very much enjoyed this, John. They've all said, and we've told you this on the podcast, this was much more challenging on their families than it was for them.
Right. And in all likelihood, it's probably going to be their last time in space. So they were enjoying it. Enjoying it every day.
Unless they totally crushed it and they're like, listen, these guys turned out to be like unbelievable up here. We got to bring them back. But I think that there's probably a lot of other people standing in line being like, wait, you were supposed to go there for 8 days. You got to spend 9 months up there. Put me in, coach.
One day, Moshe, one day we'll get the real story.
Yes, but I'm sure they'll be doing tell-all books and a lot of interviews in the coming days. Stay tuned on this podcast for more about Wilmore and Williams and their return to Earth in the coming days. Knock on wood.
From CBS Sports, March Madness college basketball begins this week, and the brackets for the men's and women's NCAA tournaments were finalized Sunday night.
All right, we have one of the more exciting weeks in sports coming up here, Jill, especially this weekend, starting on Thursday and Friday, the beginning of the NCAA annual tournament known as March Madness. Dozens of games each day, known as some of the least productive days at work, Thursday and Friday, as some of the games get started around noon Eastern time. Multiple games being played at a time, a very exciting time, and with people working from home. Well, not so much working from home, at least Thursday and Friday, some of the people that I know. As far as who are the top bids on the men's and women's side, let's start with the men here. The Auburn Tigers, selected as the number 1 overall seed in the men's tournament on Sunday. Congrats to Mo News team members Will and Ren on our team, on their alma mater, Auburn, being selected as number 1. Up there with Auburn as number 1 seeds in their respective regions, you got the Duke Blue Devils, the Houston Cougars, and the Florida Gators. We should note Auburn and Florida, both members of the SEC conference. This year, 14 of 16 SEC conference members making the March Madness 68-team field. It's a record in terms of most bids in a single conference. So there's a pretty good shot that an SEC team will win the championship. Though looking at odds from Vegas right now, the odds makers, the bookies, are saying that Duke has the best chance of winning it all. Florida has the second best odds right now, if you look at those odds. But those of you who fill out those brackets and follow the games every year know that basically anything can happen. UConn won it the last 2 years. They're a number 8 seed this year, and they could play Florida in the second round. So that's a game that I will be looking out for, and I'm sure a lot of people will potentially be making an upset. As for the tournament, as I mentioned, it gets started on Thursday. On the men's side, the first and second rounds will be played Thursday through the weekend. Then you got the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 being played the weekend of March 27th. The Final Four will take place in San Antonio beginning on April 5th. And then the championship game is on April 7th. On the women's side, UCLA is the overall 1 seed, also joining UCLA as number 1 seeds in their respective regions. Fellow LA powerhouse, USC, also a number 1 seed. And then you have South Carolina and Texas. South Carolina, we should note, has won the women's championship 2 of the last 3 years, coached by legendary Dawn Staley over there. So don't count them out. Meanwhile, when it comes to UCLA and the number 1 overall seed, they went 28-2 in the regular season. Their only losses coming against USC, their crosstown rival. And so we will be watching for that potentially to play out in the Final Four if both teams make it through the end there. We should note play on the women's side will also begin this week, and their Final Four will take place in Tampa.
And finally, from Variety, Apple TV Plus has officially renewed Ted Lasso for season 4. Jason Sudeikis will return as the pun-happy football coach. No other castings are officially confirmed at this time, although we'll likely be seeing Hannah Waddingham, Brett Goldstein, and Jeremy Swift. Sudeikis in a statement saying, as we all continue to live in a world where so many factors have conditioned us to look before we leap, in season 4, the folks at AFC Richmond learn to leap before they look, discovering that wherever they land, it is exactly where they are meant to be. Whatever, I'm just happy the show is back. Sudeikis will executive produce in addition to starring in the show. And then Warner Brothers put out a statement saying, if ever there was a show that the world needed more of right now, it would be Ted Lasso. Couldn't agree more.
Jill, over the weekend, giving you the various headlines and immigration and the Houthis and whatever. And then I put up the headline about Ted Lasso and people are like, thank you, Moshe. Thank you for giving us something something nice to look forward to. We should note season 3 was Apple TV's most watched show to date. It finished 2023 as the #1 original streaming series in the US. So clearly the folks at Apple were very keen on bringing them back for another season. He will apparently be coaching a women's team, a women's franchise for season 4. So some interesting potential storylines there. And so we'll see what happens. Season 3 sort of wrapped up a lot of the storylines, but they're coming back for more, Jill.
Yeah, there was a lot of reporting that season 3 was going to be it. So I wonder if that was the plan. And then they all were just like,
how much?
Nothing else has come up. Exactly. Yeah.
How much can we give you, Jason, to come back and give us another season? I mean, we've seen this happen for years with like famous series, right? Like NBC for years was trying to get like Friends to do another season and Seinfeld to do another season and like, various revivals. So sometimes the actors are like, no way. And some of the times the show creators are like, add a 0 and we'll be there.
As my father-in-law likes to say, the answer is money. Now tell me your problem.
All right, on this day in history, we begin nearly 2,000 years ago today, Jill, on this St. Patrick's Day. On March 17th, the year is 461. St. Patrick, the Christian missionary, bishop, and apostle of Ireland, dies in Downpatrick, Ireland. Today, he is still honored nearly 2 millennia later with the annual holiday of St. Patrick's Day. The story of St. Patrick, some of you might be familiar with, some of you may not be. He was captured and enslaved as a 16-year-old. He spent 6 years as a herder in Ireland, eventually escaping, and then he would return to Ireland. He got a call that his people needed him. He was ordained as a bishop, and so he would arrive in Ireland, began preaching the gospel. He spent about 40 years living in poverty, teaching, traveling, and working tirelessly, and then he died. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland. So where does the drinking fall in? Why does everyone drink on St. Patrick's Day? Well, that's a more modern tradition. The date of his death conveniently falls within the season of Lent, which is a time when many people abstain from certain food and alcohol. But in celebration of the life of their patron saint, Irish Christians removed the restrictions associated with drinking, at least on this day of Lent, to commemorate his death. So we have them to thank. And then, of course, many Irish Americans, Irish immigrants who came to the U.S. in the 19th century, really made St. Patrick's Day go big here in the U.S. All right. On this day in 1905, one former president gives away the bride to a future president. Teddy Roosevelt gives away Eleanor Roosevelt to Franklin Roosevelt. On this day in history, a very young Franklin Roosevelt, about 24 years old, gets married to Eleanor Roosevelt, 21 years old. Teddy Roosevelt is from the Eleanor Roosevelt side of the family. They're the Long Island Roosevelts. FDR from the upstate New York Roosevelts. Technically, FDR and Eleanor were fifth cousins who got married. FDR from the Democratic side of the family, Teddy and Eleanor from the Republican side of the family. But anyway, Teddy gives away Eleanor to Franklin. They would go on, of course, to be married for a number of decades there. Complicated marriage, Jill, we could get into in a different podcast. But interestingly, while Teddy was gung-ho about this marriage, you know who wasn't? FDR's mom. That would be Sarah Roosevelt. Sarah Roosevelt was so annoyed about this whole marriage, she tried to get Eleanor sent away before the wedding. She did not want Franklin, her dear Franklin, to marry Eleanor. And so, nonetheless, they get married. Sarah is up in Eleanor's business all the time. Eleanor talks about this in various diaries. Jill, the week that FDR is inaugurated as president for his first term, of course, he's elected 4 terms, the cover of Time magazine is Sarah Roosevelt, the president's mom. That's how notable she was. She had written a book, My Dear Franklin. She moves into the White House with them. Anyway, if you think you have a tough mother-in-law, try Eleanor Roosevelt's mother-in-law, Sarah.
Literally trying to get her sent away.
I don't want you to marry.
In like another country?
No, to like go get her education. You know, it would be great to go get a master's degree in England. Like go somewhere else. Like you shouldn't marry my son. And then she constantly gave her advice about how to raise the kids. And Sarah like literally comes to the White House with them. Like Franklin is president, Eleanor is the first lady, and who's in there? The mother-in-law, like giving Eleanor like various, feedback and decorating tips. Might be one of the many reasons Eleanor spent more of her time with her girlfriend, Eleanor's girlfriend up in New York. But that's a whole separate story that we can talk about. The various relationships that Franklin and Eleanor had with various people during their marriage. Fast forward to another White House. On this day in 2003, George W. Bush gives a major address to the world, delivering an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein, saying, leave Iraq within 48 hours or the U.S. is going to invade and remove you from power. Saddam didn't listen to that ultimatum. The U.S. would invade Iraq, engage in that second war in Iraq, taking over Iraq. Plan was to rebuild it, make it a democracy. We know how that ended. Now, 22 years later, Jill, we still have U.S. troops in Iraq. And finally, on this day in history, pop culture-wise, 22 years ago today, Punk'd by Ashton Kutcher first premieres on MTV. It was a hidden camera show that would feature various pranks on regular everyday people, but also some famous people. Ashton would go on to host it for a few seasons, I think 3 or 4, but it would actually end up running 11 seasons with various hosts. Chance the Rapper came back and did a season recently.
I loved that show. Didn't you? It was so funny.
It was revolutionary for that era, and that also introduced Ashton Kutcher to many of us for the first time. And one final item on this day in history, music history. I love this song from 1998. Casey and JoJo released All My Life 27 years ago today. Casey and JoJo were actually brothers, Cedric Haley and Joel Haley, but Cedric's nickname was Casey. Joel's nickname was JoJo, hence Casey and JoJo. Though I have seen some various reels and TikToks where people are like, have you listened to the lyrics of All My Life? Some of the lines are a little creepy.
Really?
So the issue here, Jill, with the lyrics, if you go into like the first verse, and they repeat this a few times, is, they're talking about losing their lover, right? I'll never find another lover sweeter than you. And then like there's lines in there like, close to me like my father, close to me like my sister,
my mother,
close to me like my mother, close to me like my brother. But they're talking about like a lost love interest, like romantic interest. So some people are like, I don't know. But it has a good beat to it.
Something tells me they just needed something to rhyme with lover, and brother, mother kind of fits the bill. But if you think about it, it is a little weird.
Don't question it. It was, it was one of those hits of like 1998. 1998 has a lot of hits, by the way. If you go back to 98, like, you'll look and you're like, wow, it was a great year for like memorable music, especially like those of us of the generation that, were sort of teens or college during that time.
What rhymes with lover? Okay, mother, got it. Brother,
close to me like my mother. But wait, okay.
A little weird. All right, on that note, thank you guys for listening to the podcast, the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
Thanks for all those positive reviews, 5-star. Hey, Jill, I learned over the weekend how to check your Uber rating and how many reviews you've gotten from drivers. If you go into your settings, you go into privacy settings, you can see the last 500 reviews that drivers have given you, and see how many times you've been rated 5 stars, 4 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 star.
And your rating is?
I have a 4.7 overall, which by New York standards is actually pretty good. I know those of you outside New York have like 4 9s and 5s. New York drivers are much more aggressive. I'll blame them, not my conduct in the Ubers. I think also they might be like giving me tough ratings because when you bring a kid in there and sometimes the baby cries and stuff, they'll bring you down.
Blame it on Olivia.
Yeah. My last 500 ratings, I have like 430-ish 5-star ratings, 4 stars, whatever. 19 times I've gotten a 1-star rating, Uber.
What?
19 times. How can that be? I think that these drivers are being overly aggressive in New York.
What could you have possibly done?
What did I do? Puke in your car? Like what? Like what could I have done? Like insult your family? Like no. Like maybe there were a couple times where the Uber driver tries to talk to me and I don't talk back. And is that deserving of them? I'm like, oh, I'm on a phone call or something. Like, is that deserving of a 1-star rating, Uber drivers? Anyway, I digress. Let's let the people go.
Moshe, you have truly piqued my curiosity. I want to almost go through your ratings, like who was the driver, where were you going?
They don't give you details.
I'm perplexed at how you have 19 1-star ratings.
So of the last 500, but they don't give you the dates, they don't give you the location. They just say, of your last 500 drives, these were the ratings that you got.
Interessante.
All right, everybody. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.